The envelope sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I opened it. I kept walking past it, pretending I hadn't noticed the embossed seal pressed into the wax. A wolf's head, mid-howl, silver against deep burgundy. I told myself I was busy. I told myself it was probably nothing important. I told myself I wasn't desperate enough to care about whatever was inside. All of that was a lie. My name is Jim Wills, and I was, at that point in my life, spectacularly and completely broke. The landlord had slid a notice under my door that same morning the envelope arrived. 30 days. I had 30 days to come up with 2 months of back rent or vacate the premises. My checking account had $47 in it, which was just enough for 1 more week of groceries if I was strategic about rice and didn't buy anything with a brand name. My part-time job at the bookshop had dried up when the owner decided to retire and close up without so much as 2 weeks' notice for any of us on staff. My freelance editing work had slowed to a trickle. I had 3 manuscripts sitting in my inbox from clients who had ghosted me entirely after sending them their revised chapters. $47. 30 days. On the 3rd morning, I made coffee, sat down across from the envelope, and tore it open. The paper inside was thick and cream-colored, the kind that costs more per sheet than I used to spend on lunch. The handwriting was precise and angular, black ink in a hand that brooked no carelessness. Mr. Wells, I have a business proposal for you that I believe merits your consideration. I am prepared to offer substantial compensation in exchange for a service that requires intelligence, discretion, and a willingness to enter into a formal arrangement for a period not to exceed 6 months. If you are interested, present yourself at the address below, this Friday at 10 in the morning. Do not be late. A. Jarvis. That was it. No phone number, no explanation, just an address in the part of the city where the streets were wider and quieter, where the buildings had actual stone facades and iron gates, and where people like me generally only went when we were making deliveries. I Googled the name, Ali Jarvis. The results came back faster than I expected, and there were a lot of them. The Jarvis name was old money, made older by the kind of reputation that writes itself into regional history. Originally, the family was known for land, vast stretches of it, inherited across generations. But Ali Jarvis, the current head of the family at 34 years old, had taken that old inheritance and turned it into something modern and formidable. His holdings spanned real estate development, private investment, and something the more breathless articles referred to obliquely as PAC leadership, which I initially assumed was corporate speak for heading up some kind of consortium or association. It was not corporate speak. It took me a while to understand what I was actually reading in those articles. The language was careful, the way language always gets careful when the subject is something that most of polite society pretends it hasn't fully accepted yet. Shifter families, alpha bloodlines, PAC territories that happen to correspond with suspicious precision to entire neighborhoods and business districts. Shifters were real. I knew that, obviously. Everyone knew that. They'd been known since before I was born, acknowledged legally for nearly 2 decades, and still managed to exist in a social space that was simultaneously normalized and treated as somewhat extraordinary. You knew they were there. You didn't always know who they were. Most of them preferred it that way. Ali Jarvis was not most of them. He was the alpha of one of the largest PACs in the region, openly and unapologetically so. His photograph in the business section of the regional paper showed a man who looked like the concept of authority had been given a body and expensive tailoring. Dark hair, a jaw that could have been carved from something geological, eyes that even in a grainy newspaper photograph seemed to carry some quality of attention that made you feel like you were the only thing in the room worth looking at. He was, in the most objective assessment I was capable of making, one of the most striking people I had ever seen through a screen. He was also, according to 3 separate articles published over the past 8 months, in a serious political crisis within his own PAC. I read those articles very carefully. The crisis was this: an alpha without a mate was considered, in traditional PAC hierarchy, to be an alpha in a provisional state, not illegitimate, but not fully secured either. There was a faction within his PAC, old guard traditionalists it seemed, who were using his unmated status to question his authority, to push competing candidates forward, to generally make his life difficult in ways that were apparently significant enough that even the business press had caught wind of it. There had been a formal challenge issued 3 months ago. Another prominent family with their own alpha claimant had essentially told Ali Jarvis that if he didn't present a mate at the upcoming Midsummer Conclave, an annual gathering of the regional pacts that apparently carried significant political weight, his authority as alpha would be formally contested. I read the last article twice, then sat back in my chair, looked at the envelope on my table, and said out loud to my empty apartment, "Oh." I went on Friday. I wore the nicest thing I owned, which was a charcoal blazer I'd bought secondhand 3 years ago and had kept in reasonable condition through sheer stubbornness. I took the bus to within 4 blocks of the address and walked the rest of the way because I didn't want to arrive looking like someone who took the bus, which was a stupid piece of vanity I immediately recognized as stupid and engaged in anyway. The building was a townhouse, tall, narrow-fronted, the kind of dignified old structure that had probably been built when this street was at the very edge of the fashionable part of the city, and was now so firmly established as the center of it that the address alone functioned as a credential. The gate was iron, old and heavy and very clean. I pressed the intercom button, and a voice came back after exactly 2 seconds, clipped, professional, neither warm nor cold. "Mr. Wills, please come in." The gate swung open. Inside, the house was quieter than I expected. The kind of furniture that looks simple until you realize the simplicity is itself extraordinarily expensive. A woman I assumed was some kind of assistant led me through a hallway lined with framed architectural drawings and into a study at the back of the house, where one entire wall was glass, looking out over a private courtyard garden that was, in early spring, just starting to come back to life. "Mr. Jarvis will be with you shortly. Would you like coffee?" I had already had 2 cups and was vibrating slightly from nerves, so obviously I said yes. The coffee came in a real cup, not a mug. I was sitting in a chair that probably cost more than my rent and drinking coffee from a cup that probably cost more than my blazer when Ali Jarvis walked through the door, and every piece of research and preparation I had done in the preceding 3 days became temporarily, completely irrelevant. Photographs had not done him justice in either direction. He was taller than I'd imagined, probably 6'2", maybe slightly more, and he moved with the particular economy of someone who had never in their life needed to take up space deliberately, because they occupied it naturally, without effort. He was wearing a charcoal sweater and dark trousers, nothing formal, and somehow managed to look like he had dressed for a meeting with someone very important. He looked at me the way his photograph had suggested he might look at things, with complete, undivided, slightly unnerving attention. "Mr. Wills." Not a question. He sat in a chair across from me, crossed one ankle over his knee, and picked up a file folder from the side table. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation." My voice came out level. I was proud of that. "I'll be direct." He opened the file. "I need a mate." The silence that followed that sentence was probably only about 2 seconds long. It felt longer. "I understand you've read about the current political situation within my pack," he continued, without waiting for me to respond, which was good because I hadn't decided yet what to respond with. "The Midsummer Conclave is 11 weeks away. The challenge from the Daldron family requires me to present an established, recognized mate at that conclave. If I cannot do so, the formal challenge proceeds, and that process is—" He paused, and something moved briefly behind his expression. Disruptive, to many people beyond just myself. "So you're looking to get married in 11 weeks, I said. "I'm looking to present a mate at the conclave. What that arrangement looks like in practical terms is negotiable." He set the file down. "To be clear, I am proposing a contract arrangement, 6 months minimum, with terms to be formally agreed upon. During that time, you would present publicly as my mate, attend relevant social and pack functions, reside here at least part of the time, and behave in all public-facing contexts as though our relationship is genuine." Why me? The question came out before I finished deciding to ask it. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement. Something more careful than that. "Because I need someone intelligent enough to navigate this environment convincingly, discreet enough to keep the arrangement confidential, and not affiliated with any of the families or factions that are currently involved in pack politics." "You're an outsider. That's an asset." "I'm also a man," I pointed out. "Same-sex mating is not uncommon among shifters," he said, in a tone that suggested this was a fact so basic it barely warranted saying. "It would raise fewer questions in some respects than the alternative. The pack is accustomed to it." I looked at him for a moment. He looked back, That attention of his was remarkable. Not aggressive, not invasive. Just complete. Like whatever was in his field of vision got his entire consideration without him having to work at it. "What's the compensation?" I asked. He told me. I kept my face very neutral and set my coffee cup down very carefully because the number he said was enough to clear my debt, pay 6 months of rent in advance, and leave me with something substantial remaining. It was, to be precise, more money than I had ever seen attached to my name at any single point in my life. There would also be, he added, as if the first number weren't enough, a termination payment at the conclusion of the 6-month period, contingent on successful completion of the conclave and the withdrawal of the challenge. I can have the full contract prepared for your review within 24 hours. I should have asked for time to think about it. I should have consulted someone, a friend, a lawyer, anyone with more perspective than I currently had, while sitting in a room with Ali Jarvis and his unreasonably precise attention and his very large number. "I'll review the contract," I said. He nodded once, as if this had been the expected outcome. "There's one additional thing you should know before you sign anything." "Okay." "Shifter matings," he said carefully, "involve a biological component that human social arrangements don't. The act of formal claiming, what we call bonding, creates a physical connection between mates that has certain persistent effects. For the arrangement to be convincing to other shifters, particularly alphas who can sense these things, we would need to bond formally." I stared at him. "That bond would be real," he continued, still in that careful, measured voice. "It cannot be faked. Its effects include heightened awareness of each other, some degree of emotional resonance, and in some cases, certain physiological responses that are mediated by pack biology." He paused. "Some of those responses can be unexpected." "Unexpected how?" He met my eyes. There was something in his face that I couldn't quite read, not discomfort exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like a man saying something he'd rather not have to say, but was too honest to leave out. "The contract will include full disclosure of all known biological effects," he said. "I'd ask you to read that section with particular care." I told him I would. I went home. I read the contract for 6 straight hours. The section on biological effects was written in careful legal language that took me a while to fully parse. Heightened sensory awareness, emotional mirroring, increased physical vitality, and then buried in the middle of a paragraph about rare documented cases. In a small percentage of bonds involving an alpha and a human partner, particularly where the bond is formed during or near peak cycle alignment, there exists a documented possibility of fertility transfer, a temporary biological state in which the human partner acquires certain reproductive capacities not standard to their biology. This state is mediated by the alpha's pheromonal environment and resolves upon the conclusion of the bond. The frequency of this outcome is statistically low, approximately 3 to 7% of formally bonded alpha-human pairings under the relevant conditions, and the contracting parties agree to acknowledge this possibility as a known and disclosed risk. I read that paragraph 4 times, then I sat there for a while, then I picked up my pen and I signed. The first 2 weeks were a kind of negotiation that neither of us had put in the contract. Moving even part of my things into the townhouse felt surreal in a way I couldn't quite explain. My books looked strange on the shelves of the guest room, which was larger than my entire apartment, with a window seat and actual crown molding, as if they knew they didn't belong here and were silently judging me for bringing them. Partly for practical reasons, and partly because letting go of it entirely felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Ali and I had a working arrangement that was professional in a way that felt almost aggressive. We had meals together when schedules aligned, because a mate who never shared space with their alpha would be unconvincing. We discussed practically and without apparent discomfort on either side what our relationship history would look like to outsiders, how we'd met, how long we'd known each other, the shape of a romance that had never happened. He was good at this, better than I expected. He was a focused, precise person who approached the logistics of our arrangement with the same methodical attention he apparently gave everything in his life. And while that should have made the whole situation feel more clinical than it already was, it had the unexpected effect of making me feel like what we were building, even if it was artificial, was at least solid. He didn't treat the arrangement carelessly. He didn't treat me carelessly. The bonding ceremony was private. Just the two of us and an older woman named Hessa, who served as the pack's ceremonial elder, with warm eyes and a direct way of speaking that reminded me a little of my grandmother. Hessa walked me through what would happen with a thoroughness that I appreciated, and she looked at me, with an expression that was more appraising than dismissive, as if she was genuinely trying to assess whether I could handle what was coming. "The bond takes," she said to me quietly, while Ali was on the other side of the room speaking with her assistant. "It doesn't matter that the circumstances are what they are. You should know that. Once it's done, it's real. His biology won't know the difference, and after a while, yours won't either." "What does that mean, practically?" She studied me. "It means you'll know when he's upset before he tells you. It means certain things about him will become familiar in a way that has nothing to do with time spent together. It means," she stopped, "just be honest with yourself about what you're feeling. That's the only advice I have." The bonding itself was not what I'd expected. I had braced for something that felt more transactional, a ritual checkbox, a necessary formality. What actually happened was quieter and more disorienting than that. Ali took my hands in both of his, and Hessa spoke words in a language that wasn't one I knew. And there was a moment, right at the end, when his eyes met mine and held them, where something shifted in my chest, like a door opening onto a room I hadn't known was there. Warmth. That was the first thing. A warmth that started at the contact point of our hands and moved inward, slow and thorough, the way heat moves through stone. And then, underneath that, something I could only describe as recognition, irrational and immediate, the sensation of something slotting into place that had apparently always been slightly out of alignment. Ali's hands tightened on mine. Just slightly. Just for a second. Hessa said something final, and it was done. We went back to our separate rooms that evening. We were not, at this stage of the arrangement, sharing a room. That was addressed in the contract too, as something to be negotiated when and if the public situation required it. I lay in my guest room, with its crown molding and my out-of-place books, and the window seat overlooking the courtyard, and tried to catalog what I was feeling, the way Hessa had suggested. There was something that hadn't been there before, a low, ambient awareness, like a second heartbeat not quite synced to my own. Just at the edge of perception. Not intrusive, not frightening, just there. Present in the way a new piece of furniture is present in a room you know well. You keep noticing it wasn't there before. I told myself it was just the biology. I told myself it would normalize. I almost believed myself. The first pack function I attended was something called a pack dinner, a monthly gathering of what I came to understand was the core of Ali's inner circle, maybe 30 people, held at the townhouse. Ali had spent 3 evenings briefing me on names, relationships, histories, and the subtle social cartography of who deferred to whom and why. I had taken notes. I am, as it turns out, a reasonably good student when the subject matter has high stakes. Walking into that room at Ali's side, with his hand at the small of my back, a gesture he'd introduced that first evening, with the matter-of-fact explanation that it was how an alpha physically signals their mate's status to the pack, was one of the more intense social experiences of my life. They looked at me, not rudely, not hostilely for the most part, but with the particular quality of assessment that I'd come to learn was instinctive in shifters, a reading that went beyond social appraisal into something more literal, as if they were taking in information about me through senses I simply didn't have. What they read, apparently, passed whatever test they were running. A man named Declan, who was Ali's second, a position that seemed to combine chief of staff with something closer to a loyal lieutenant, was the first to extend his hand to me with something that looked like genuine warmth. Declan had a broad, open face and the kind of laugh that sounded like it belonged in a much larger room. "We've heard a lot about you," he said, and I noticed that Ali's hand at my back pressed very slightly, which I interpreted as either reassurance or a very subtle warning. "Good things, I hope," I said. "Interesting things," Declan said, still grinning, and that was somehow more reassuring than good would have been. I got through the evening, more than got through it. I managed by the end of the night to have real conversations with several of Ali's pack members. A woman named Petra, who ran the pack's community outreach programs and had strong opinions about urban planning that I found genuinely fascinating. 2 brothers, Kai and Theo, who were funny in the way that people are funny when they've spent their whole lives perfecting comedy as a defense mechanism, which I recognized because I had done the same thing. An older man named Seraphin, who was quiet and watchful and who said very little to me, but whose nod at the end of the night, when I caught his eye, felt like something that had been carefully considered before being given. On the drive home, Ali drove a large, quietly expensive car that he handled with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. I found myself thinking that these were people I could like. People I might genuinely like, if the circumstances were different, if I had met them some other way. You did well, Ali said. He didn't look away from the road when he said it. Was I that uncertain? No, a pause. You weren't uncertain at all. I meant it as a genuine observation, not a surprise. I watched the city slide past the window. Petra is remarkable. The work she does with the resettlement program, she'd be pleased to hear that. Another pause. She liked you. How do you know? He glanced at me then, briefly, before his eyes went back to the road. I can tell. That quiet gift of his, reading the room, reading people, through means I was only beginning to understand, was something I found myself noticing more and more. He never deployed it carelessly. That was the thing. He had this capacity to know things about the people around him, to sense things, and he used it with a restraint that struck me as a choice he made deliberately, every time. I thought about that for a long time, after we got home and went our separate ways for the night. I lay in my guest room and felt the low, ambient pulse of the bond at the edge of my awareness, and I thought about a man who had the power to know things and chose to look away. 6 weeks in, the bond started changing. I noticed it first as a disruption in my sleep. Not insomnia exactly. I was sleeping, but the sleep was thin and restless in a way that hadn't been true before. I'd wake at odd hours with a sense of something demanding attention without being able to identify what. I felt warm all the time, even when the rooms were cool. Food tasted different, not bad, just more present, more vivid, as if someone had turned up a dial on my sensory experience by a few notches. I told myself I was adjusting to a new environment. I told myself it was stress. I did not, for approximately 10 more days, consider the paragraph in the contract about rare biological outcomes. When I finally connected the dots, I was standing in the ensuite bathroom of my guest room at approximately 4:30 in the morning, looking at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror, with an expression on my face that I can only describe as philosophical. Okay, I said to my reflection. Okay. The kit I'd ordered discreetly online, specifically designed for human shifter bond interactions, which was apparently enough of an existing product category to have multiple brands competing for market share, gave me the answer I had already intuited was coming. I sat on the edge of the tub for a while. The contract had disclosed this. The contract had, with very careful legal language, said this was possible. I had signed knowing it was possible. I had signed for reasons that, sitting on the cold edge of the tub at 4:30 in the morning, felt both completely sensible and completely insane. 3 to 7%. I was in the 3 to 7%. I needed to tell Ali. I told him the next morning. I waited until after he'd had coffee, because I had learned in 6 weeks that Ali Jarvis was not at his best before coffee. Not badly, he was never unpleasant, but he moved through the first 20 minutes of the day with a focused inwardness that seemed to require the coffee to resolve. I had learned this the way you learn things about people you live with, through accumulation of small observations, and the fact that I had been paying that kind of attention to him was something I had been carefully not examining. We were at the kitchen table. The morning light was doing something nice to the courtyard garden outside. I had a cup of tea. He had his coffee. I put my hands around my cup, looked at the table and said, "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at me, that complete focused attention. I went back and read that section of the contract again, I said, the section about rare biological outcomes. The pause was very brief. Something moved behind his eyes. When did you? Last night, early this morning. I finally looked up at him. The biological indicator was positive. The silence that followed was long enough that I counted it. Not deliberately, just as a nervous reflex. 7 seconds. He set down his coffee cup with careful precision. His jaw worked once, as if he was processing something that required more than just the surface of his mind. And then, very quietly, "Are you all right?" Of everything he could have said, that was not what I prepared for. I had prepared for logistics. I had prepared for contract discussion, for the question of what this meant for the arrangement, for some version of practical problem solving that treated this as a complication to be managed. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I think so. I needed you to know." He nodded, slowly, with the quality of someone filing something in a place in their mind that was important. "How long had you suspected?" "About a week and a half. I kept telling myself it was adjustment. Then I stopped telling myself things and actually thought about it." Something almost softened at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition. That sounds like you. It did sound like me. The fact that he'd recognized it, that he'd been paying attention to enough of me to recognize it, sat strangely in my chest. The contract, I started. Forget the contract. He said it quietly, but without hesitation. We're not going to treat this as a contract matter. Ali, Jim. He said my name the way he said very few things, without the slight precision that governed most of his speech, with something less controlled underneath it. Whatever happens from here, we're not going to put it in a ledger. I'm not willing to do that. I looked at him for a long moment. The bond sat between us, warm and present, that low resonance that I had stopped trying to ignore about 2 weeks in. In that moment I could feel something in it that matched what I was seeing on his face, something that was working hard to be measured, and wasn't entirely succeeding. You're not going to be calm about this, I said, not as an accusation. I'm being very calm. You're performing calm. Another almost smile. He looked away briefly, toward the courtyard. When he looked back, something in his face had opened slightly. Just slightly, the way a very well-constructed door will open if you know exactly where to press. No, I'm not going to be entirely calm about this. I would like to be, because I think it would help you to have someone calm, but… He stopped. I didn't expect this. I won't pretend I did. Neither did I. What do you want to do? The question was open in a way that was genuine. No weight on it, no suggestion of what the correct answer should be, just the question, given to me, and the implicit understanding that my answer was the one that mattered. I had been awake for most of the night thinking about exactly this. I had thought about every angle, every practical consideration, every version of how this could go. I had tried to be rational about it. I had tried to approach it the way I would approach a manuscript with structural problems, identify the issue, map the options, choose the path that had the most to recommend it. What I kept coming back to, underneath all the rational architecture, was something much simpler and much more frightening. When I imagined any version of this that didn't include staying here, didn't include the morning light in the courtyard, and the coffee cups, and the low warm resonance of a bond that was not supposed to be real, and increasingly felt like the most real thing in my life, that version made something in me recoil. Not from fear, from loss. I want to stay, I said. If you want that. I know this wasn't in the contract. I know this changes the terms of everything. I'm not trying to. Jim. His voice was very quiet. Stop. I stopped. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. His hands were warm. They were always warm. One of those things about him I had catalogued without meaning to, and the contact sent a low pulse through the bond that felt like a bell being struck at a great distance, pure and resonant. I want you to stay, he said. Not because of what you've just told me, not because of the conclave or the contract or any of that, because… He paused, and this pause was different from his usual ones, less controlled, the pause of someone choosing between the safe thing to say and the true thing. Because the house has been different with you in it. Because you argued with Petra about drainage infrastructure for 40 minutes at the last packed dinner, and she was delighted. Because you reorganized the study bookshelves by publication date rather than subject, and it bothered me for a week until I sat with it and realized it was actually better. He stopped again, because I find that I'm looking for you when you're not in the room. My heart was doing something complicated. That doesn't sound like a business reason, I said. No, he agreed. The conclave came 6 weeks later, which gave us 6 weeks to navigate something that was no longer a performance. This is harder than performing, as it turns out. Performance has the protection of its own frame. You know what it is, you know where the edges are, you know that what happens inside it isn't quite real, and can be put down when you leave the stage. When the frame falls away, when the thing between you is not the thing you agreed to, but something that grew up through the agreement like a plant through pavement, that's when it gets frightening. That's when you have to be brave in ways that weren't written down anywhere. We talked more. Not the strategic, briefing-style conversations of the early weeks, but actual conversations, the kind that start as one thing and become another, the kind that go until midnight without anyone noticing the time pass. He told me about growing up in a pack, the particular texture of that childhood, the way belonging to something larger than yourself was both gift and weight. How he had understood from an early age that being the alpha's heir meant his own wants and needs would always be negotiations with the larger good. How he had learned very young to keep those wants and needs close. I told him about the bookshop, about the years I'd spent doing work I loved for not enough money and being obscurely convinced that the doing of the work was its own justification, until the doing of the work stopped paying rent and that conviction had to be tested against reality. About my family, scattered and warm and slightly bewildered by me in a comfortable sort of way. About what it had felt like to sign his contract. The exact complicated mixture of practicality and recklessness, and something else I hadn't fully named, which he heard and nodded at as if it made perfect sense to him. He started coming to find me in the evenings, not as a strategy, not as practice, just gravitating toward wherever I was, which was usually the study or the window seat in my room, and sitting somewhere near me, and either joining whatever I was doing or working quietly in parallel. The pack noticed. Declan gave me a look one evening that was entirely knowing, warm, and said nothing, which communicated everything. The bond shifted too. Deepened is the word I'd use. It had been warm before, it became something I could locate with precision, something with directionality. I could tell when he was in a different part of the house, could feel the specific quality of his attention when it was on me versus when it was elsewhere. He told me that from his side it was similar, that I had become a constant in his peripheral awareness the way few things were. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, but there was something underneath the matter-of-factness that was neither matter-of-fact at all. 3 weeks before the conclave, I moved into his room. This was not a strategy. We agreed about that without discussing it directly, the way you can sometimes agree on things through the quality of silence you share, rather than through words. The guest room had, gradually, stopped being where I actually spent my time. His room had better light in the mornings, and it smelled like him, and the bond settled into something calmer and less ambient when we were close. That first night I lay beside him in the dark, and felt his breathing slow as he moved toward sleep, and the bond between us was a warm, steady thing, and I thought, this was not what I signed up for, not what either of us signed up for, and I could not, at that moment or any moment since, find a version of my life where I wished it hadn't happened. He turned toward me in the dark, not quite asleep, and I felt his awareness of me through the bond, diffuse and warm and present. "Jim," he said quietly. "Yeah, I'm glad you opened the envelope." I laughed, softly, because the night was quiet, and it felt right to keep it that way. I almost didn't. I know. A pause. I would have sent another one. The Midsummer Conclave was held at a large property in the countryside, 2 hours outside the city. The kind of place that suggested old agreements about neutral ground, big enough to host multiple packs without any single alpha having territorial advantage. It was a 3-day event, and we arrived on the first afternoon, along with Declan, Petra, Seraphin, and 5 others from Ali's core circle. Walking into the reception with Ali was, in its way, a rehearsal of something I had been preparing for without knowing it. Not the performance of 6 weeks ago, not the strategic, briefed, carefully mapped presentation of a fiction. Something different. Something that had the confidence that only comes from the thing being real. The other alphas at the conclave were a lesson in the range of what that word could mean. Some of them were what I'd have expected, physically formidable, projecting authority with the blunt directness of people who had never needed to persuade, only to declare. Others surprised me, quieter, more observant, with an intelligence behind their eyes that reminded me of Ali. A few I liked immediately, a few I didn't like at all, and the bond made Ali's assessment of each one available to me as a sort of low-frequency counterpoint to my own impressions, which was simultaneously strange and remarkably useful. The Aldrin family arrived on the second morning. Marcus Aldrin was the head of the family, mid-50s, with a kind of face that had been good-looking once and had settled into something more territorial. His son, Garrett, was the one who had been positioned as the challenger, maybe 26, built for intimidation, radiating a quality of suppressed aggression that was interesting to observe from the safety of not being the person it was aimed at. Their arrival produced a particular kind of tension in the room, the kind that doesn't make noise but takes up space. I felt Ali shift slightly beside me, not backward, but more present, and the bond gave me the distinct impression of something settling into readiness. Not hostility, readiness. Marcus Aldrin's eyes found Ali first, then moved to me. The assessment was brief and very thorough. Whatever he found, he hadn't expected it. I watched him recalibrate in real time, saw him look at the two of us together and measure something against whatever he'd anticipated, and find that his measurement came up differently than planned. He looked between Ali and me again, and I realized with a clarity that had no smugness in it, just quiet certainty, that what he was reading was real. Not because we were performing it well, Because it was real. We hadn't manufactured this to win the conclave. We had built this, clumsily and honestly, and in ways neither of us had planned, and it had become what it was on its own terms. It turned out the most convincing argument we could have made. The formal presentations happened on the second afternoon, each alpha with their mate, in a gathering that felt partly ceremonial, partly an elaborate social reading exercise in which the assembled pack leaders collectively assessed the stability and legitimacy of each bond. I had been given a fairly detailed briefing on what this would involve. What I hadn't fully anticipated was the way it would feel to stand before a room full of people who could sense the bond with considerably more precision than I could articulate it, and to watch them register it. Seraphin, who had been quiet and watchful from the first evening I'd met him, was standing near the back of the room. When Allie and I were presented, I saw Seraphin's expression do something, not quite a smile, but a release, like a man who had been holding something carefully for a long time, and had finally been given permission to put it down. I thought, he knew. He's known for a while. I thought maybe he's been waiting for Ollie to figure it out. The Aldrin challenge was formally raised on the third morning, which was the procedural moment the whole conclave had been built around. Marcus Aldrin stood before the assembled alphas and made his case, which was focused, well-prepared, and entirely addressed to a situation that no longer existed. He spoke about provisional status. He spoke about unmated alphas and the instability that accompanied them. He spoke about the responsibilities of leadership. He was arguing against a ghost. The situation he was describing, an alpha without secure footing, without a genuine bond, without the wholeness that pack tradition associated with mated leadership, was not the situation anyone in that room was looking at when they looked at Ollie. When Ollie responded, he was brief. He was always brief when he had the better argument. He didn't ornament what didn't need ornamenting. He spoke about the bond, about the pack's stability, about the people who depended on settled leadership and deserved better than a political disruption served for the sake of ambition. He didn't look at me while he spoke except once, briefly, and what passed between us in that look, I'm not going to try to put words around, because some things don't have words that are the right size for them. The vote among the assembled alphas to dismiss the formal challenge passed with only 2 dissenting votes, both of which everyone in the room knew were the Aldrin family's political clients and carried no real surprise. After it was over, after the handshakes and the formal courtesies and the long afternoon of meals and conversations that served as the conclave's social epilogue, we were finally alone, just the 2 of us, in the room we'd been given, with the evening coming in through a window that looked over a meadow going gold in the late light. Ollie sat on the edge of the bed. I stood at the window. We stayed like that for a moment, in the particular silence that follows a long effort finally completed. It's done, I said. Yes. The 6 months? Jim. His voice was quiet, with something underneath the quiet. Stop counting the months. I turned from the window. He was looking at me, and there it was again, that quality of his attention that I had learned over weeks and weeks, that gave you its complete consideration without demanding anything in return, except that it was different now, or I was different now, or both of us were different because there was nothing measured about it, nothing held back. The contract ends, he said. What we are to each other doesn't, not unless you want it to. I'm not. He stopped, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely uncertain, not about the logic, about the outcome. I'm not able to offer you the pretense that this is still an arrangement. It stopped being an arrangement a long time ago for me. I crossed the room. I sat next to him on the edge of the bed, close enough that our shoulders touched, and felt the bond settle into something even quieter and more certain than it had been, as if it too had been waiting for this and was glad of the resolution. For me too, I said. It stopped for me too. He exhaled, a long, slow breath that sounded like something being let go. Then his hand found mine, the same where it had at the bonding ceremony, and the contact sent that resonant warmth through the bond, and I thought, this is what belonging feels like. Not performing belonging, not rehearsing it or earning it or hoping for it, just having it, being in the place you're supposed to be. I have something to ask you, he said. Okay, not tonight. Tonight is for, he gestured vaguely toward the meadow, the evening, the ended conflict, the beginning of something else. Tonight is for this. I'll ask you tomorrow. Will I know the answer before you ask? He turned his head to look at me. The almost smile was there. And then it was a real one. Full and unhurried. The kind of smile I'd been working toward for weeks without quite knowing I was working toward it. I think you already do. He asked me in the morning. We were standing in that meadow. He'd woken me before full light and said, with no preamble whatsoever, "Come outside." And I had followed him because this was something I apparently did now, followed where he led without needing to be convinced. And we stood in the meadow, while the light came up slow and gold from the east, and he asked me. He asked me not with legal language, not with contract terms. He asked me with his hands in mine and his eyes on my face, and his voice carrying the particular quality of something he'd thought about very carefully and decided to say without armor. "Yes," I said. "Obviously yes." The walk back to the house was slow, because neither of us was particularly interested in arriving. Telling the pack was unexpectedly the thing that made it most real. Not the conclave, not the formal victory over the challenge, not even the quiet morning in the meadow. Walking into the packed dinner 3 weeks later and having Declan read something in us before we'd said a word, and letting out a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a shout, but occupied the acoustic space between them. That was what made it real. Having Petra hug me with her whole body, which I had not expected, and which turned out to be the kind of hug that reorganizes you slightly. Having Seraphin shake my hand and hold it for a moment and look at me with those quiet, watchful eyes that had always seemed to be assessing something, and finally understand that he had been waiting since the first evening to see if I was someone worth waiting for. They knew. Most of them had known for a while. That's the thing about Pack I was learning. Secrets have a different half-life in this environment, not because people talk, but because they sense. They had sensed what was happening before Allie and I had admitted it to ourselves, and they had been, most of them, quietly rooting for us. The news about the pregnancy, which was by then beginning to show in ways that made the news somewhat redundant, was received with the specific kind of warmth that comes from people who already love you being glad for your happiness. Kai and Theo made an enormous amount of noise. Petra cried, and then was annoyed at herself for crying, and then made me promise to tell her everything about how I was feeling, at regular intervals. Declan looked at Allie with an expression that contained 17 years of friendship, and said very simply, "Good." And Allie, who did not tend toward demonstrable emotion in group settings, put his hand at my back in that particular way. And I felt through the bond the quality of what he was feeling, large and warm and settled, like a house after a storm. Hessa came to see us the following week. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I had told Allie, where the morning light had been doing something nice to the courtyard, and looked at me with those warm, appraising eyes, and said, "I knew the bond would take." "You said something like that at the beginning," I reminded her. "His biology wouldn't know the difference. Mine wouldn't either." I was right. She tilted her head. "Were you frightened, after you understood what was happening?" I thought about it honestly. Not frightened exactly, more aware of how much had happened that I hadn't planned for, how much had grown in directions I wasn't steering. "That's how the best things tend to grow," she said. "The steered ones turn out too careful, too small." I looked at her. "Did he ask you to engineer this? The timing, the peak cycle alignment, the contract mentioned it. Were the conditions constructed?" She looked back at me with an expression that was entirely calm and gave absolutely nothing away. What the contract disclosed was a possibility. What happened was biology and the bond and two people who were paying attention. She picked up her tea. "Make of that what you will, Jim." I made of it exactly what I chose to make of it, which was not very much, because the outcome was what it was regardless, and the outcome was not something I had any interest in resenting. We were married, formally, legally, by civil ceremony with Declan as a witness, and my mother in the front row making the face she makes when she is very happy and trying to seem like she had expected this. On a morning in early autumn, when the courtyard garden was at its most elaborate, and the light through the kitchen window had the particular amber quality that I had come to associate with good things. My mother had liked Ali approximately 4 minutes after meeting him, which was faster than she had liked most people I'd introduced her to in my life. She had shaken his hand, looked at him for a long moment with the eyes that I had inherited from her, and that I now recognized in myself when I was doing my most serious assessing, and said, "You look at my son the right way." She said it as a statement of fact rather than a compliment. He had taken it that way. The reception was at the townhouse, which was our house by then in all the ways that mattered and in most of the legal ways too. And it was full of people I had come to love over the course of a year that I would spend the rest of my life not being able to fully explain. Kai and Theo caused an incident involving the appetizers that became a story told at every subsequent pack function for the next several years. Petra gave a speech that was both moving and structured, which was very Petra, and she cried during it again and was again annoyed at herself. Seraphin, asked to say something, said only, "I'm glad he opened the door," which was brief and meant everything. Ali didn't give a speech. He spoke to me privately after most of the guests had moved to the courtyard, and the house had the particular hum of a party going well without needing supervision. He found me in the study, where else, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me with that complete, unhurried attention. "You reorganized the books again," he said. I looked at the shelves. "By original language of composition this time, I think it's right." "You thought the publication date one was right." "It was right for a while. Some organizational systems are only right for their moment." I turned back to him. "Is this moment okay?" He crossed the study and sat beside me, and the bond was warm and present, and as familiar as breathing. And he said, "This moment is the best one I've had." Our son was born in the deep part of winter, when the courtyard garden was bare and the mornings were slow and very quiet. He looked like both of us in the shifting, uncertain way of newborns. Impossible to fully read, full of potential, carrying some quality that felt like the future hasn't decided yet, and is enjoying the uncertainty. Ali held him with the careful, deliberate attention he brought to things that mattered most, and watched him with eyes that were doing something very private that he didn't try to conceal or explain. Hessa came to see him 2 days after he was born. She sat with him in the chair by the window for a long time, with the particular patience of someone who has watched many things begin and knows better than to rush the watching. "He'll be strong," she said finally. "He should also be kind," I said. "That's not up to me or the bond." She looked at me over the baby's head. I was learning the nature of the life I'd been handed, or chosen, or built, or some intricate combination of all three, that the things most worth having were the things I'd never been planning for. I had planned, on the day I opened that envelope, for a contract with an exit date and a bank balance that would let me start over. I had gotten instead a house full of morning light and strong coffee and people I would choose again every time. A man who looked for me when I wasn't in the room and argued with me about bookshelves and said very little when it wasn't worth saying and meant everything he said when he said it. A bond that was supposed to be temporary and turned out to be the most permanent thing about me. Ali came into the room quietly, with the particular silence of someone who has learned over months and months not to disturb the moment they're entering. He stood behind me, looking at Hessa with the baby, and his hands came to rest at my shoulder in that way he had. Not the calculated, positioning gesture of the early weeks, but the simple, reflexive thing it had become, just needing to be in contact, just the body doing what felt true. "He's peaceful," Ali said. "He's got your face when you're thinking," I said. "He's got your stubbornness." "He has excellent judgment," I said, which made Hessa laugh quietly. The courtyard beyond the window was bare and still and waiting, the way winter gardens always are, not empty, just holding. Everything that would come in spring was already there underneath, already arranged, growing in directions no one had steered. I leaned back slightly into Ali's warmth and felt the bond between us and thought I almost didn't open the envelope. I thought, I'm glad I did. I thought, some things are only right for their moment, and this moment, this one, with the bare winter garden and the quiet room and the small new life that we hadn't planned for and couldn't imagine having planned, this one was right for a very long time.